Welcome to day 2, day 3. First day was workshops. This is the second day of content. We're so glad that you're here. We have 2 wonderful presenters in our hour session this morning. Our first presenter is Greg Dobson. He is with UNC Asheville. He has been in this field for quite a while alongside of me. So we have been working on all sorts of GIS-focused work for many, many years. I'm going to let him tell you more about himself, and we'll go ahead and get started.
Thanks, Hope. Yeah, we've been together a long time, I guess. So, yeah, thanks everyone for coming out for the early morning session. I guess I drew the short straw, the 8:30 session. So, appreciate everyone being here. Like Hope said, my name's Greg Dobson. I'm the Director of Geospatial Technology at UNC Asheville's NEMAC. We're an applied research center on campus at UNC Asheville. And today I'm going to be talking about a project that we've been working on for a long time. I think we're in our 7th year now of working on this project, and I'm going to go through the details of it. I do want to recognize a couple of my co-authors, one of which is in the room, Jessica Orlando, our co-project coordinator, if you will. And then this project is funded through the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, as well as NOAA, so I've got a couple of folks to recognize there as well. All right, so I don't know, I imagine most of you all are familiar with NOAA. Maybe you're not as familiar with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. They're the nation's largest conservation-oriented grant funding program, really, in the country, based in D.C. And, you know, their mission is really to support projects, provide funding for projects that increase fish and wildlife habitat, that deal with resilience, just a whole slate of different things. And, one of the things that obviously they're really interested in now is, thinking about how can they increase fish and wildlife habitat in a way that can also benefit human community resilience as well. And so that's one of the things that makes this assessment kind of unique, is that it's not just focused on one side or the other. It really brings the two together. So one of the things that they also have is the National Coastal Resilience Fund. And this is a large pot of money that communities like yourselves, I know a lot of you in the room represent different communities. And so this is a pot of money that you can apply for and receive funds to do things like nature-based solutions. I know I saw a couple of talks yesterday that talk about nature-based solutions and other types of resilience projects. If you think about wetland mitigation, beach nourishment, whatever it might be, again, projects that can have that benefit of increasing human community resilience, but also fish and wildlife habitat as well. So I encourage you to take a look at that. I think this year they have $140 million to award to communities all over the U.S. The call just went out a couple of weeks ago. And so this project that I'm talking about today, then, these regional coastal resilience assessments, this is a tool, one of the tools that NFWF and NOAA use in deciding which projects get funded. That doesn't mean if your project doesn't meet all the criteria of these regional assessments that it's not going to get funding. But again, it's just one of the tools that they use to kind of take a screening level view and think about which projects they want to fund. And so that's kind of how the conception of this came together 7 or 8 years ago. These assessments have 3 key parts. So we have a community exposure index, a fish and wildlife index, and then what we call our resilience hubs. And I'll go through and talk about each of those individually and talk about how they come together. But again, keep in mind that it is this dual benefit, and that is kind of one of the unique things about this assessment. So so far, really at this point, we've covered just about all U.S. coastlines, including our territories in the Caribbean and the South Pacific, Hawaii, Alaska. We're in the process of finishing up the Great Lakes region. We'll have that done later this spring. But you can see kind of what these boundaries look like in each of these regions that we've worked in. For the most part, the boundary of this assessment are the Huck 8 watersheds that drain directly into the oceans. And so that's another thing that makes this coastal assessment a little bit unique, is that it's not just focused on that sliver of coastline. It's not just looking at sea level rise or storm surge. It brings a lot of different things together, and it takes into account upstream influences as well, because obviously that's going to impact what happens at the coast. So that gives you a sense of what the boundary is. We actually started this project in 2015 here in North Carolina. We did a pilot project for the Cape Fear River watershed, and then that just kind of quickly grew into the rest of the country. So the Community Exposure Index, this is our first kind of key piece, again, one of three pieces that make up these assessments. And this is further subdivided into two sub-indices. So we have what we call our threat index and our community asset index. This is all very much a geospatial exercise. So all these different data sets here, these are all geospatial data sets that we're bringing in on the threat input. On the threat index side, our inputs include things like storm surge and sea level rise and soil characteristics, geologic stressors in some parts of the country, where we have landslides or land subsidence right at the coastline. That can be an important consideration. And then other regional stressors. Certainly there's some, things that are going on in different regions that are unique to that region. So we bring all these together. These are all at a 30-meter resolution. So it's a coarse model, but again, it's meant to be a regional or a national model. So we don't drive into the details and do kind of finer scale modeling. We stack all these together, and that gives us our threat index. So the areas that you see there in the darker reds are telling us where we would expect to see a higher concentration of these different threat inputs. And then on the community asset index side, so this is where we're looking at critical community assets, so things like critical facilities, critical infrastructure. Where's our hospitals and police stations and wastewater treatment plants and power plants, that type of infrastructure. We're not taking into account commercial or industrial properties. We're not taking into account residential properties. But what are those critical facilities that a community would need to get back up and going following a major storm event? We also bring in areas of high population density and high social vulnerability. And so those stack together in a similar way. So the areas that you see there in darker blue are indicative of where we would expect to see more of those assets present. We combine those two sub-indices, and that gives us our community exposure index. And so the areas in the darker brown are telling us where we would expect to see a higher concentration of these threat inputs that are, or these hazards, if you will, these flood hazards that are impacting different community assets. And I do want to point out that this is an exposure analysis. I know we've heard a little bit already yesterday about risk and vulnerability. This is not a risk or vulnerability assessment. We don't take that we don't go to that level of detail in what we're doing here. This is just trying to understand where assets are exposed to various coastal flood-related threats. The second piece of this is what we call our Fish and Wildlife Index. And so it too is further subdivided into two sub-indices. We have our terrestrial index and an aquatic or marine index, depending on which region we're working in. But again, this is where we're pulling in those fish and wildlife species, on the terrestrial side, where our species occurrence and, different habitat suitabilities, where's those important bird areas, other priority conservation areas. So just a variety of different, pieces that come in there. Again, those kind of stack together. And so the areas you see in darker green are just telling us where we'd expect to see a higher concentration of those of those terrestrial species. And then on the aquatic and marine side, we're doing the same thing, obviously focus more on things like the marine protected areas, the NOAA fish essential habitat. I can tell you I've learned a lot more about terrestrial and aquatic species over the last few years than I ever thought I would, not coming from a biology or ecology background. But again, these two sub-indices then come together and create what is then our Fish and Wildlife Index. And so these areas in darker pinks and purples are just telling us where that highest concentration is of both terrestrial and aquatic species. So then the third piece of this is what we call our resilience hubs. And so the resilience hubs are really meant to be a way that we can look at the landscape and try to identify areas that might already be suitable for doing some type of nature-based solution or other resilience project. And so to create these resilience hubs, we start out by just trying to understand where open space is. And so we do this by looking at, for instance, the National Land Cover data set or CCAP data in some instances. We look at the PADIS, the USGS Protected Areas Database, so that's all lands that are in some sort of protective status or conserved status. So we take a look at those, and this kind of gives us raw cores, if we will. What you see in green there is what we call our raw cores. And then what we do with our community exposure index and our fish and wildlife index is we overlay that and we do some zonal statistics to try to understand within each of those individual cores, what is my community exposure in that area? What is the fish and wildlife index value in those areas? And then that allows us to rank these cores and essentially create, again, what we call the resilience hub. So on the image on the far right there, you see the polygons or the areas that are in the darkest oranges and reds. So those are getting the highest score. In those areas where you're seeing high community exposure values, meaning there's coastal flood threats there, there's community assets there, and then we're also seeing high fish and wildlife index values, meaning there's high concentrations of species in that area too. So that gives us the resilience hubs. And so the resilience hubs then are really what NIFWF and NOAA can start to take a look at as projects are submitted. They can say, oh, okay, well, if these areas are already some kind of open space, maybe they're already suitable for doing some kind of nature-based solution, that might be a good area to target. Again, it doesn't mean if you propose a project that's outside one of these resilience hubs that it's not going to get funded. This is, again, one of many tools that they look at to, consider for projects that do get funded, what projects get funded. So, one of the things that we have done, well, I'll back up and say, obviously with each of the regions that we've worked in, we've put together a report, a final report, as you might imagine. But one of the things that they asked us to do was, be able to provide this data in an interactive way that would allow users to have access to the data, to interact with the data. So my team built this built a custom-built tool, a web tool to do that. It's called the Coastal Resilience Evaluation and Siting Tool, or CREST as we like to refer to it. And this tool, again, kind of allows anyone to come in and take a look at the data for these different regions. And you can check it out there at resilientcoast.org, but I'll ask that you wait just a minute because I'm going to attempt a live demo here. I know that you're not really supposed to do that, but I'm going to give it a try. If you're streaming your favorite series, maybe you can pause that for a moment and I'll see if the Wi-Fi gods shine down on me here. So this is the tool. This is the landing page for that. And so obviously the first thing you do when you come here is pick a region that you're interested in. So I'll pick on the continental U.S. here. And by default, you can see that the resilience hub layer is already turned on. So you can kind of get a sense for what that looks like. And this is kind of your standard web tool at this point. You can zoom in and turn different layers on and off. I'm used to using a mouse here, so I'll see if I can navigate with just the mouse pad. I'll zoom into the Wilmington area for an example. There we go. So you can see, what those resilience hubs look like. You can hit the drop down here to see the legend. You can click on the little information button to get a description of what that layer is. Again, kind of a standard viewer. You can turn these different layers on and off. That's the community exposure index. Again, there in the Wilmington area. You can see the fish and wildlife index. You can obviously change the the background, the base map, if you want to do something different there. And then the inputs for these indices are in here as well. So if you want to take a look at, for instance, sea level rise in that area, you can do that. You can turn on, the flood-prone areas, the FEMA flood-prone areas. So again, you can explore all the different layers. I'll go back and turn on the community exposure index. But something else that you can do with this is actually start to do a little bit of analysis. So let's say you're interested in putting some kind of nature-based solution on the ground here in the greater Wilmington area. You can come over here on the left and you can see where it says Analyze Project Sites, and you have an option to draw an area on the map. So I'm going to click that button there. I'm going to turn off the option to create a buffer around the area I draw. That's an option that you can choose to include or not. And I'm just going to click on the map here, and I'm just going to draw a little polygon here, not too big, so it'll calculate quickly here, hopefully. And it's going to do its little thing in the background. And then here in just a moment, there we go, it worked. We can see it worked over the Wi-Fi. You know, you never know when you try a live demo. You can see what it gives me some information then about that area. So we get this bar graph here. And so what happens here is then I'm seeing, well, what's the community exposure, value in that area? Or what's the threat index value? What's the fish and wildlife index value? So you can see right away, kind of what that area, is what the assessment is, values of the assessment is telling me about that area. And you can get some additional information about this. So if I click on Get Details, it'll show me that same summary chart, but then I can see more specifically, what is driving the fish and wildlife index, the aquatic or the terrestrial inputs. And as I come on down here, I can look at the community asset index and the threat index and see what individual inputs are kind of helping to drive that score. You could export this to a table if you wanted to, so you can click on the table option there and export that into a table and then download that. I'll go back to the overview here. Maybe, though, you're interested in comparing that with another area. So you could actually come back to the map, and with the draw area still active, I could draw another polygon, maybe out here on the coast, and do that. And then it'll crank there for just a minute, and I can compare, two different areas. If you've got project sites in a shapefile, you could upload the shapefile and do the same thing. So different ways that you could, start to interact with the tool and, do a little bit of analysis as well. And then we also provide the data. So if you come up here, we're in the Analyze Project Sites tab. If you come over here to the Data and Reports tab, you can see that for each of the regions, we've got, of course, a link to the final report, but also the data. If I scroll down to the continental U.S., you can download all the data. If you want to bring that into your own GIS, you can do that as well. So a couple of different ways that you can interact with the results from this assessment, not just having a final report, but having a tool to interact with the data, and then obviously being able to download the data itself. All right, I'll jump back into the slides just real quickly. Let's see, there we go. And let's see, here are my backup slides in case the demo didn't work. Always good to have a backup plan. So what are our next steps? As I mentioned, we're completing the U.S. Great Lakes region, so that'll be done this spring. And then, the original assessment for the continental U.S. was released in 2019. So we've been asked to go back and kind of update that, see what new data may be available. As we've gone through this process over the last 7 years, we've learned a lot along the way. Our methodologies have been updated along the way. So we want to take an opportunity to go back and try to standardize this across all regions as much as possible. So that's one of the things that we'll be working on, for the rest of this year, and making sure that each of these regions are utilizing the latest and greatest data. We're also working on a version 2 of the web tool that'll be available later this year. That's going to add some enhancements that we've identified through some of the user testing that we've done. So that's kind of some next steps for that. And with that, I'll take any questions that you might have. Doug.
For the species, are you looking just at the threatened and endangered species, or are you also looking at the at-risk species?
Yeah, so the question is, did we look at just threatened and endangered species, or did we look at risk species? I think we looked at both. So not just threatened and endangered species by any means, but really just trying to understand what the distribution of all these species were. So, take the important bird areas, for instance, from BirdLife International, just where are those areas, regardless of if they're threatened or not, just trying to understand what that range looks like. Anyone else? You have a second question. Go ahead, Doug.
Are you open to doing a higher resolution analysis of the data that is available?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And, we get asked that sometimes. So again, this is meant to be kind of a high-level screening tool. It's very regional. I've talked about, the coarseness, of the day. I mean, 30 meters is not all that coarse. I mean, you can, start to do some things with that. But one of the things that we always encourage people, if they're interested in kind of that deeper dive analysis, if they want to zoom in and do something with finer detail, then that's what needs to happen. They need to be, utilizing more higher res data, because obviously in a lot of these areas, the higher res data is available. In some areas that we've worked in, that's not the case. But, if I don't know if NIFWIF's interested in trying to do something like that for the entire study area, but again, as individuals or organizations are interested in doing that locally, we'd be very interested in talking about that. So.
I don't know if you brought this up at the very beginning of the presentation, but what kind of organizations are mainly using this tool?
Yeah, another great question. So again, kind of the original intent of this was, to be a tool that these funding organizations, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and NOAA could use in scoring proposals. But more importantly, we've always wanted, the communities to be able to use this tool. So we're seeing, we've got some great use cases of different communities locally that have been able to use this and some of their resilience planning and just trying to understand what their general exposure is. I was talking with someone earlier in the year down in Puerto Rico, for example, that was using this for some of their work that they were doing to preserve some of their beaches down there. I know Dr. Procope at UNC Wilmington has used some of this in some of her work. So it's a pretty range of different types of users that we've seen accessing this. But at the community level, mostly is where we're seeing people use this.
Great presentation. Are you tracking also the projects that are being funded in these?
Yeah, so, and I should say that that's kind of not in my wheelhouse, but the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation does have those metrics that they're tracking. The question was, are projects being tracked so they can see how they evolve over time? And yes, you can check out their website. It's the National Coastal Resilience Fund, and they've got some good information on that, the projects that they've awarded in the past and whatnot, so. And, Alice and I were talking, she's obviously going next, and I think this was a great kind of layout here because, what I've talked about is very regional in scale, and then what you're going to hear next is going to be more of a local scale, application of kind of taking this and drilling down to a finer resolution.
So is there an update, like as new projects come in?
Yeah, exactly. There is an update plan. Again, that's going to be happening throughout, this year. We're going to be updating the regions with new data and, again, kind of updated methodologies. And then we're talking with NIFWIF now to kind of figure out what a long-range maintenance plan is going to be for this. Yep.
So is your scoring mechanism part of your referencing?
Not the scoring in terms of how they score projects, no, because again, this is just a tool to kind of help them do that. We've got documentation on how we rank these resilience hubs, if you will, but the actual project scoring is not necessarily part of the assessment. All right, thank you.